let's just review here. So cell organelles, tiny parts inside of a cell that have a job to do. Okay, found in all sorts of cells, and we started talking about some of them. The cell wall, found only in plant cells. It's made of cellulose. It's not a living part of the cell. It's sort of formed and then stays that way. Gives support and protection to the plant. Whereas the cell membrane is a living, flexible part of both plant and animal cells that helps to regulate what can go in and out. And then the cytoplasm basically fills up the rest of the cell. All the space inside the cell is filled with the cytoplasm that holds all the other organelles in place. And then we have the nucleus, a very important organelle in the cell. Contains all the genetic information, contains the chromosomes, sort of directs and is responsible for how the cell functions. Surrounded by a membrane, the nuclear membrane contains chromosomes, these packets of DNA inside. Also has the nucleolus that creates ribosomes. Which leads us to the parts of the cell that are make and transport things. The ER, okay, endoplasmic reticulum, is where these system of tubes that run throughout the cell are, and they transport things from one part to another. Inside of them or attached to them are these ribosomes. These ribosomes are tiny little organelles that make proteins, the building blocks of the cell, of all tissue basically. And then we have the Golgi bodies, which package up any proteins that need to be sent out of the cell, excreted, through these little bubbles that they form, and they send things out of the cell. Okay, so we have a few more organelles that we need to finish up with. And then we're going to talk about what these things look like and where they're located. So vacuoles. Vacuoles are sort of little storage areas within a cell. Okay? And some of these vacuoles may store water. Some could store food particles. Can store a variety of things. Okay? In plants, they often have a large central vacuole, we call it, that fills up much of the space inside of the cell. But in animals, they're generally much smaller. Okay? So if we look at these examples here, on this plant cell, this big area in the middle looks kind of like an ice cube. That's all one large vacuole. And it gets filled up with water, and it gives the plant structure and rigidity. It's why what happens if you don't water plants? Before they die, what do we call what happens?
Wilted.
They wilt. And what do they kind of do? Kind of like flop over, right? That's because those central vacuoles are sort of losing water and kind of deflating, and then they sort of don't provide that structure. In the animal cells, there are these small little bubbles in there that hold various things. We also have an organelle, so in this is a plant cell. Obviously, it's got this thick cell wall around the outside. Got some chloroplasts here that are green. But then all this gray area, that is the vacuole in the plant cell. It's filled up with water, putting pressure against the cell wall, keeping it strong. These are lysosomes. Lysosomes they look very similar to vacuoles. In fact, you won't have to tell them apart in a diagram because they look too similar. These are small little sacs that have enzymes for digestion so that they can break things down. You know, when parts of the cell are no longer working, like if some ribosomes are no longer working and they need to be sort of recycled, the lysosomes break them down and digest them. All right, and our last two organelles are extremely important. They're both related to energy. Mitochondria and the chloroplasts. So mitochondria are found in all cells, both plant cells, animal cells, and their job is to supply the cell with energy. Because there's a chemical reaction that happens inside of the mitochondria that releases energy. Does anyone remember what we called it? We learned about it in living things when we talked about metabolism. Which process releases energy? Respiration. Technically, we would call it cellular respiration, when it takes energy and releases it, takes sugar and releases the energy from it. It could help remember the mighty mitochondria, because they're kind of like the powerhouse of the cell. They supply all the necessary energy for cells to live and work. In your body, cells that use a lot of energy, muscle cells for example, they have a lot of mitochondria in the cells. Other cells that don't quite use as much energy have less. And you could recognize the mitochondria because they look kind of like a bean shape with a bunch of folds inside. Okay? And this is where this process of respiration happens. Sebastian?
How big is this cell?
Not very big. About, it depends. Some cells are much bigger, some are much smaller, but you know, you saw your cheek cells. How big were your cheek cells? Oh no, you didn't yet. We'll see them next week. You know, 500 micrometers or so, you know, maybe on average. Maybe less than that, 300 for your cheek cells and so on. This is what an actual one looks like under the electron microscope, oval with these folds inside. So mitochondria release energy. Chloroplasts are found in plants only. They are green. They are what make the grass outside that's still green. It's green because you're seeing the chloroplasts inside of those cells. And chloroplasts contain a pigment called chlorophyll, which can absorb the sun's energy and use it to do what? Photosynthesis, to make food. Now, we're going to stop from now on saying plants make their own food, really. Because that's kind of simplistic. When we say plants make their own food, what we really are saying is they just make one specific thing, glucose. They make sugar. That's what they are making in the chloroplasts. And that's what they're using for energy, to get energy. So they use light to make glucose in these structures. It's where photosynthesis takes place. You know, these are some cells you're going to see, maybe tomorrow, I don't know. But the green parts in here, it's kind of hard to see under high power, you can see them better. Those little green parts are the chloroplasts. They look like these ovals, they have discs in them which actually contain the chlorophyll. All right, so next step is for us to start to learn what these things look like and be able to identify them in a diagram. Okay, so we have some cutaway drawings here of some cells. Now again, these are just sort of generalized cells. Most cells don't actually look like either one of these, but we kind of use these as an example to help us understand them.
Is every cell different?
Yes, every cell is different. This is like a quarter of a cell cut so you can see the insides. Let's go through and label some of these. Plant cell.
Can you cut cells?
Yeah. All right, let me try to remember the order here. So this is generally an animal cell. How do we know?
It's oval shaped.
It's what?
Oval shaped.
Oval shaped, roundish. It's not sort of boxy. What else? Laura?
It has like the purple outline.
Excuse me?
It has the
This?
Yeah.
The membrane. It doesn't have a cell wall. Okay. It's not, doesn't have any chloroplasts. Okay. All right. So if we look at this diagram, I think we start here. What would you call these? What organelle do you think that is? It's close to the nucleus. Okay. Abby? Yeah, that's the rough ER. Good. Why do you call it the rough ER, not smooth, Abby?
Because it has.
Yeah, it has those little dots on it. We'll get to those little dots in a minute. Yeah, that's the rough ER. How about this arrow? What is this pointing to? Seems to be pointing to nothing, but it's something in the cell. Raise your hand. And I will tell you, or go ahead, Antonio.
Cytoplasm?
Good. For some reason, and I think it's because they all start with the same letters and they sort of end in some similar endings, people always confuse three organelles. Cytoplasm, chloroplasts, and chromosome. Because they all, I guess, sound somewhat similar. So try to make sure you keep them separate in your brain. All right, how about next up here? Well, this one you may confuse with the ER, but it's not the ER. Looks very similar though, because it sort of has similar functions. Yeah?
Mitochondria?
No, not the mitochondria. Thomas?
Golgi body?
Yeah, those are the Golgi bodies. And these, I sometimes call them stacks of pancakes. Okay, how about down here? Jane?
Oh,
This one.
mitochondria?
That's the mitochondria. Again, the oval with folds inside of it. And the next two are basically look exactly the same. And I don't know which is which. Doesn't really matter. You don't need to know either. But what do you think these two things are? They're two different things, but they look the same. It's just sort of little bubbles that contain stuff. Maya?
Vacuoles?
Yeah, the lysosomes and vacuoles. They really look the same. You won't be responsible for knowing the difference between the two in an animal cell. Oh, this tiny thing over here. It's also the same thing that's over here that made these rough ER rough. Abby? Yeah, the ribosome is how you actually pronounce it, but ribosome may help you remember what it does, because they make what? Protein. All right, now this whole thing in here is well, I guess this arrow is pointing to this whole thing, which is what, Sebastian? The nucleus. What about this arrow that's pointing to this layer? What do we label that as? Anthony? You're right, it's not the wall. So we've eliminated one possible answer out of billions. Okay, any other? Donovan?
The nucleus envelope.
Okay, sometimes it's called the nuclear envelope, but we will generally call it something a little bit different. Nuclear membrane. Yeah? All right, so we already said this whole thing is the nucleus. Now, it's not labeled, unfortunately, but inside would also be the nucleus, and the nucleolus and chromosomes. How about this one? Now, technically, I wish this arrow were pointing down here a little bit, but that's okay. Maureen? Yeah, ER it says here, but I would say smooth ER if it was pointing here, but it's not quite, because you know the difference between rough and smooth. How about this last one? Yeah?
Membrane?
That's the cell membrane. Okay, here we have a plant cell. What causes the plant cell? It's a couple things. Jane?
That's sort of like more box than oval.
More boxy?
Yeah, more box.
Good.
It has the cell wall.
Okay, has a cell wall. Has these green structures around the outside. All right, so let's start up here. What is this yellowish layer? around the outside, Donovan?
The cell wall.
That is a cell wall. What do you think this is here, then? What is this thing in the middle? Sierra? Yeah, that's the large central vacuole I was talking about. Fills up lots of the space inside of the plant cell. Now, the third one is a little bit difficult to see, but it's this blue layer that's along the inside there of the cell wall. Anthony?
Cytoplasm.
No. Abby?
Cell membrane.
That's the cell membrane. It's just inside of the cell wall. How about this little thing here? Yeah, the colors in these are just sort of random, except for one organelle. What would you call this little dot there? Right? Ribosome. They're the smallest organelle. How about the gray? Raymond?
Cytoplasm.
That's the cytoplasm. Well, this thing, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this.
What?
These.
Oh, wait, I know this. Oh, I know.
Emily?
Can I say it?
Chloroplasts, yes, those are the chloroplasts. And they usually are in the cell around the outside because they need to be exposed to light. How about here? This thing in general. Anthony?
Thank you. The nucleus.
That's the nucleus. This is the nuclear membrane.
What? Oh, you got
I know,
more specific.
yeah. All right, how about this in here? This dark area within the nucleus. We haven't talked about this one in our diagrams yet, Laura. What?
It's the mouth.
Inside of the nucleus. Tanya? Nucleolus makes the ribosomes. This arrow's pointing, I guess it's pointing to the whole thing, yeah. What would these X's be? I wish it were pointing to these things. What are those?
The eyeballs.
They're not the squinty eyeballs. What are they? Okay. Those are chromosomes. How about this thing here? Oval. Those lines inside. James? Mitochondria. How about these? You don't need to be specific here because it's not very clear. This. Sebastian. DR. And this?
Is it rough or smooth?
It looks like smooth, but I just think they saw the ribosome. And last one. My Golgi body. There are stacks of pancakes and drops of syrup.